From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
I knew that if I insisted on putting the language in agreement with them, that I would be caught afoul of Mrs. Reagan, which was not a very pleasant situation.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Ken Khachigian, author of Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. And for this election week, we spend time later on in today's program with a man who has spent lots of time behind closed doors with both Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. First, we're joined by Dr. Kathleen O'Toole, Assistant Provost for K-12 Education at Hillsdale College. Dr. O'Toole, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Discussing today an op-ed you wrote a while ago in the Detroit News, classical charter schools can help reverse COVID learning losses and can be found at DetroitNews.com. Start with the basics, I guess. Are we... What does the data say? Are we still catching up from this learning loss that was suffered during the COVID pandemic and then the subsequent school shutdowns?
Unsurprisingly, the fact that children were not attending school regularly for the better part of a year, in some cases longer than a year, depending on the state, and that we relied on virtual instruction and sending home packets and things as a substitute for in-person learning did not go very well. Mm-hmm. And especially for young students who are at the very beginning of their education, kindergarten through third grade, when they're learning to read, learning basic math skills, learning the habits that will enable them to be students and continue learning for the rest of their years, especially for those students. The effects continue to persist.
Some people might take a look and say, they're a little behind. It's no big deal. What are the possible ramifications? Why should we care that students are behind where they should be, and if they continue to lag behind where they should be in their education?
Well, the data we have is regarding reading and math scores. And I can talk about the effects of a poor reading and math education over the course of a student's K through 12 years. But first, I think a point needs to be made about the habits that are developed. Anyone who has young children, I have two very young children right now, they're 2 and 3, knows that the name of the game is building habits. And if you don't build the habits well, chaos will reign. That's the phase that I'm in right now. It gets a little bit, they're a little bit more capable when they're in kindergarten, but they're still very much building the habits of going to school, conducting themselves in a certain way when they're in the classroom, developing the ability to listen, developing the ability to learn in a room with others, developing the ability to apply their minds to work, and then, of course, understanding the difference between learning time and playtime. Mm-hmm. And those two things in Hillsdale-affiliated schools are not really mixed. Both are very important, but learning time is one thing, playtime is another thing. And they're both important, but need to be separate. That whole way of going about your life as a 5 or 6 year old is new. And you're entering school for the first time and learning this ability to get yourself into learning mode that you will need to have for the rest of your childhood and well into adulthood. If these habits aren't formed, they won't naturally happen. They have to be formed eventually. And there's kind of a golden opportunity to form those habits when children are young. It becomes more difficult as they get older.
Let's look at reading and math. There's kind of two different things happening when it comes to those subjects in a child's early learning. How about math first?
Learning mathematics is like building a skyscraper. It begins with, everyone knows the beginning of the mathematics skyscraper. You learn addition first, and then you learn subtraction, then you learn multiplication and division. Why is it that way? Is it because we've always done it that way? No, it's because that's the logical order in which those 4 essential mathematical concepts have to be taught. You cannot understand multiplication unless you understand addition first. It can't be done. Same thing with division and subtraction. So it's got to proceed in that order. The rest of math education is that way too. That's the beauty of mathematics. It's kind of pure and clean. And so the order in which it needs to be taught is logical, and we can know it. And if we follow it, it will work. Other subjects it's a little bit less clear, although the same principles apply.
Mm-hmm.
These students who lost math instruction in the early years of the pandemic, and who were not given an opportunity to go back and build the foundation of their math skyscraper, are at risk, because the rest of the math skyscraper is being built. And if there are holes in the early stages of the foundation, it'll be shaky and it'll eventually topple. The math skyscraper tends to topple when students encounter a more advanced mathematical concept.
Mm-hmm.
The first most difficult one, or the first difficult concept you encounter, is fractions. And that comes about third or fourth grade. And if you don't have division, which means having multiplication, subtraction, addition fully under your belt, you just won't be able to get fractions. And it'll happen again with algebra. And so these students will start to show the gaps in their foundation if we don't go back and fill them in properly. Reading is a similar story. The acquisition of reading skills is a process that goes on throughout a child's K through 12 education. It begins with decoding English words. And there's a period, kindergarten through third grade, where we talk about a child learning to read. And then at about third grade, a child has enough reading ability that they can start reading to learn.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you can give them a text and they have enough ability to decode, enough vocabulary, enough content knowledge to read that text and get other knowledge from it other than how to decode English. If a child's learning to read foundation isn't built properly, as it already wasn't being built properly in a lot of American education, but it definitely was not being built properly when children were not going to school, then their ability to read to learn will be damaged.
Mm-hmm.
And reading is, in a sense, the most important thing you learn in school, because without the ability to read, you reach a point in your life where you can't learn anything new.
From a teacher's perspective, can you talk perhaps a little about that challenge then of having to expedite the learning process, or to help those children catch up in the classroom to make up for those losses?
Yeah, that's really hard. And we run into this all the time because we work with brand new schools.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't just start with kindergarten.
Right.
They start with kindergarten through sixth grade, or sometimes more than that. My own school started kindergarten through 10th grade. And so we were welcoming students into the first year of school who were in 7th and 8th grade. They'd never studied any formal grammar. They'd never studied Singapore math, which is the kind of logical way that we go about it. They'd never had phonics when they were in elementary school. And so they had all of these gaps in their foundation. The good news is children are made to learn. Mm-hmm. That is what childhood is learning. They're not like us. They are open to learning, and they are nimble, and they are able to absorb new information really quickly. And so it's not as difficult as you might think. The challenge is knowing how to fill the gap. And so we would do things, at the beginning of the year by have a 2-week intensive on English grammar for new students. And they'd spend a couple of hours a day just reviewing the things that the rest of the classmates had done before. Mm-hmm. And they were able with a few months of concerted work and support by the teachers and their families to catch right up. Any child can do that kind of thing if teachers are given the opportunity to slow down and fill in those gaps. And, it may seem like we'd be losing time by doing that, but the shaky foundation will continue to be shaky. Mm-hmm. You must not go forward. You have to fill it in.
Dr. Kathleen O'Toole is with us. She is Assistant Provost for K-12 Education at Hillsdale College. Hillsdale K-12 has a network of these classical charter schools across the country. What does the available data now tell us about the effectiveness of those classical charter schools to help in this fight?
Well, the data that we have about the classical schools the effect of the COVID shutdowns on classical schools shows that the classical schools had less decline in student achievement. And I think that's for a very simple reason. Classical schools have a plan for students' education, kindergarten through 12th grade, and they were able, when students were no longer attending school or whether they were when they were attending school remotely, to identify exactly what instruction was being lost. And then when they had the opportunity to be back with the kids, they knew exactly what the plan should be in order to get everyone back on track. On top of that, looking at Hillsdale schools and thinking back to that time, we were very eager to get back in the classroom with students in person as quickly as was legal and safe. And in that time when it was not possible to be with students, we kept the principles of in-person instruction alive for as long as possible. And so Zoom instruction was synchronous. And we tried as hard as we could to replicate the energy and the engagement that you see in an in-person class. I remember visiting some of our schools in Colorado, and I watched a teacher, it was a time when some of the students had come back to school in person, but parents had the ability to keep some of them at home if they preferred. And I watched a teacher with a classroom of maybe 18 students, and then she had 6 or 8 on Zoom, and she was teaching the Zoom students and the in-person students simultaneously. And she had the iPads front and center in front of her, and she was checking for questions in the chat, checking for raised hands on this tiny little screen, while giving live, in-person, energetic instruction to the 18 humans that she was with. It was an incredible amount of work. I mean, the amount of brain power that goes into keeping track of both of those groups of students while delivering a content-rich lesson. But she wouldn't have wanted to do it any other way because she knew the power of being right there with her students.
A question we should answer, I think, what occurs when we talk about these classical charter schools is, okay, that might be good for some students, but is it for everyone? Is a classical education like the one offered at Hillsdale College classical charter schools, does it fit for everyone, or is it for only a particular type of student?
It's for everyone. Classical education is an orderly course of study that is well-rounded, and it happens in classrooms with teachers who are excellent at explaining. There is no child that will not benefit from that. The course of study is good for everyone to know, regardless of where you come from, regardless of where you are going. And because the instruction is so vivid, so engaging, you learn more in a classical school than you do in a less personal, less energetic environment. So I think, classical schools, because of their origin in private education, have a reputation sometimes of being elite, only for tuition-paying families or something. But that's just an accident. That's not inherent to classical education.
Dr. Kathleen O'Toole, Assistant Provost for K-12 Education at Hillsdale College. You can find her op-ed at the Detroit News. Classical charter schools could help reverse COVID learning losses. Dr. O'Toole, thank you for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Up next, Ken Khachigian joins us. He'll tell us more about his new memoir, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
If you're passionate about classical education and you're looking for the next step, Hillsdale College's Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education is now offering 2 master's degree programs. These programs provide students with a broad philosophical, historical, literary, and pedagogical perspective on classical education. The Master of Arts in Classical Education is a 2-year in-person program on Hillsdale's campus in Michigan, while the Master of Classical Education Leadership is a 3-year hybrid program with a 1-week summer class held at Hillsdale College. Whether you're interested in teaching, administration, or another area within the field of classical education, we're prepared to offer you a foundational, time-proven approach to your studies. We want to see your application soon. Applications must be submitted on or before December 15, 2024 for full consideration. To learn more and submit your application, visit classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu. That's classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. Find older episodes of this program plus all sorts of great Hillsdale audio. We're joined now by Ken Khachigian. He is the author of the new book, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Also Director Emeritus of the Richard Nixon Foundation Board of Directors, veteran of 9 presidential campaigns, and chief speechwriter and senior political advisor for President Ronald Reagan. Ken, thanks so much for joining us.
Good. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Always wonderful to hear these stories from someone who was there, and as they say, in the room where all things happened. I want to begin by asking you about your experiences overall. I mean, the American people and our listeners have some idea of the culture of the White House that may have picked up from other books, that may have picked up from popular culture, TV shows. Is the portrayal that perhaps most of us have and the perception true to what you experienced in the Nixon and Reagan administrations?
Well, television and movies are dramatizations. They like to get people excited, and TV shows like The West Wing and movies like Frost Nixon and others are hyped up generally to get folks overstated view of what it's like in the White House, and movies like All the President's Men, and usually they bear only a slight resemblance to reality, but all movies are basically portrayals and dramatizations. So if you really want to get into the meat, you need to talk to people who've been there, like me, and honestly, and my book is which is why I'm glad you have me on, because in a lot of the books about biographies and memoirs, a lot of the memoirs, most of the memoirs about the Reagan years, frankly, have been ghostwritten. And, a lot of my colleagues just don't have time. Lynn Nossiger and Larry Speaks and Mike Deaver and Jim Baker, chief of staff, and all of them had ghostwriters write their books. And so they don't get the real feel for it. I didn't ghostwrite my book. So to get a real honest and revealing account of what it's actually like to be there in the room, as I've written the book, you have to have someone who gives an honest account. And I took very detailed notes of everything I did with President Nixon and President Reagan. So what I convey are it's like almost transcriptions. Now, it's not the White House tapes, but it's pretty close. And I try to do portrayals of personalities and characters, and I try to do it in an honest way as best I can. And so, what you get, what you get in the movies and TV shows are not. I wouldn't take those to the bank, frankly.
Ken, you worked for President Nixon, worked for President Reagan, both with deep roots in the state of California, which now is known as a leftist haven. But back then was read occasionally in the presidential elections and had havens of conservatism. Do you think that the culture of California helped to form both of their approaches to politics in Washington?
I think so. California was not, we didn't have 40-odd million people back in 1946 when Dick Nixon was elected to the Congress. And when Ronald Reagan got elected to the governorship, the culture of California was wholly different. In fact, I just didn't work for those two presidents. I helped was the lead strategist for Governor George Duke-Majan when he won the governorship in 1982, and I helped Dan Lundgren get elected Attorney General in 1990, and I worked with Pete Wilson. So Republicans were winning elections up through 1994, California, when the culture was such that we still believed in strong borders and strong criminal laws, and the universities weren't, they were open institutions to open ideas, and they weren't as closed as they are now. The concept of radical taxation really began with Jerry Brown, frankly, who didn't have much of a sense of controlling government. He was sort of off there in some starry-eyed land and lost control of when he got into a second term when he returned to the governorship. So things changed pretty dramatically beginning in the 90s and then in the turn of the century. And Governor Schwarzenegger was, although he was a Republican, was not in the same Republican mold as Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. So that culture shift changed largely also because I would have to say the unions started taking over the schools and had a huge impact on the education of our children, and the universities, of course, had a much bigger impact on education. When I went to college at the University of California, Santa Barbara, even though a lot of my professors were, I would say, were liberal, they didn't try to influence my opinion or the opinion of their classes. They gave a very balanced view of their courses, but now I think that's wholly different. So I think that's what's happened to California over the last few years.
We won't get into everything, of course, inside Behind Closed Doors, the new book from Ken Khachigian. There's a wonderful part at the beginning where you take us through the prep for the Frost-Nixon interviews. On a larger Watergate scale, though, you lament that Nixon did not end up having the support of the House and Senate Republicans. They didn't stand up for him during the Watergate scandal and post-Watergate scandal. Why didn't he find that support? What happened?
I think there was just overall fatigue. That's a really interesting question you asked. And I think looking back, people forget that Nixon came into office bearing an enormous burden that was left he was left with a snarling wolf at his doorstep, and that was Vietnam War, left to him by the Kennedy-Johnson administration. 540,000 men in Vietnam, with 500 of them being killed every month, with another 1,000 casualties. And he was trying to draw down that war. And the protests, which began under Johnson, spilled over into Nixon's administration, with the massive protests all across the country, beginning right after Nixon took office. The Republicans in Congress were in the position of having to defend what then turned into Nixon's war, although it wasn't Nixon's war. It was really Kennedy and Johnson's war, but they had to defend Nixon's war policies as he was trying to bring the war down, and he had to continue the defense of that, what was going on in the Vietnam War, because he was trying to balance off China against the Soviet Union because they were thermonuclear war powers, and he was trying to offset what was happening on a much grander scale. So what took place was he was calling on his colleagues, Republican colleagues in Congress, for their support, for monetary support, for financial support, in a Congress that was dominated by Democrats. And by the time Watergate hit in 1972 and then up through 74, after 2 years of fighting Watergate, the Republicans in Congress were just tired. They were really just tired of defending the Vietnam policies. They were tired of defending the media attacks on Watergate that were all, and the partisan attacks from their colleagues in Congress. And the other factor involved was that there was, in 1973, was the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East, caused the Arab oil embargo, and gas prices shot up in the fall of 73 and early 74. They shot up by 35%. So now Nixon was faced with a recession, and so Americans were angry across the board. So Republicans in Congress and the Senate and House were faced with having to defend an administration that was bearing the burden of the end of the Vietnam War, which ended with the peace talks at the beginning of 73, with the burden of Watergate, and now you have a recession in 73. And so with the midterm elections coming up and just a couple of months away from August of 74, it's not the bravery doesn't take place when you're on the ballot quite often. So they were just tired of fighting.
Ken Khachigian with us, his new book, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Chief speechwriter, senior political advisor for President Reagan. You have the Watergate scandal with Nixon. You have Iran-Contra with Ronald Reagan. How would you compare or contrast the approaches in dealing with those topics in those various administrations?
Watergate was dragged out for 2 years. And it was what similar between the two of them was that both presidents really had very little knowledge of a lot of the true facts going into them. Obviously, Richard Nixon, just so your listeners are aware, a lot of people think that he instituted the break-in, that's crazy. He had no knowledge of the Watergate break-in. He didn't authorize it. He had nothing to do with it. And he was getting bad information about who was in charge. He was getting denials from the leadership at his campaign committee about who instituted it. So he instantly went to his backup plan, which was political damage control. In Reagan's case, it was pretty much the same. He didn't have the full facts instantly with regard to Iran-Contra. He didn't, while he authorized the weapons transfer that got him in trouble, it was rather a confusing situation. I think he thought he was doing the right thing. But then he wasn't getting all the I think, proper information. And I think what he thought he had done was the right thing for his foreign policy, but he didn't realize that he was getting enmeshed in something that was deeper than it was. And so in both cases, things got out of control more than they wanted to. I think people need to understand that presidents aren't just dealing with these scandals when they're in the presidency. They've got a lot of other things they're dealing with. Mm-hmm. They're dealing with national defense. They're dealing with the daily activities of the presidency. They're dealing with daily intelligence reports that they're getting. They're getting intelligence briefs every morning from their the National Security Council. They're dealing with the massive amount of information coming from their congressional liaison. So the presidency doesn't just deal with the scandals that come inside their door. So they're bombarded every day with other events, so you don't just sit there. So now, how am I going to resolve the scandal that's dealing at my front door? And a lot of times, the easiest route is to not deal daily with whatever the scandal is, and put it on the back burner. And that's what happened, I think, both with Watergate and Iran-Contra, until both of them got out of control.
Ken, there's lots in Behind Closed Doors about Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan, and the relationship she had both with the president and the relationship he had with you and other staffers. You sort of run the gamut from early in the administration. You describe her as being a chief of staff, Ronald Reagan's tough guy when it was needed. And then you take it all the way through this, I guess we'd say, conflict you had with her around the 1987 State of the Union address. The president wanted to include some language about protecting the unborn. Nancy behind him, shaking her head, no, don't do it. Well, how would you describe Nancy Reagan's role, in the president's administration? How important was she in shaping the message that eventually went to the American public?
Well, she was there was no one closer to the president than Mrs. Reagan. He relied on her so much for advice on everything. If there was good cop, bad cop, if she had to be bad cop, she was bad cop. And if he wanted to convey a message that he was uncomfortable in conveying, sometimes he would have Mrs. Reagan convey it. And she was helpful in the campaign of '80, for example. I describe her as the chief of staff because she helped bring order to the campaign. If there was, to me, she was very helpful in teaching me what was the best way for him to communicate sometimes. And then later in the '84 campaign, when the president was getting bad advice from his chief of staff and his deputy chief of staff on how to communicate in the campaign, and Mrs. Reagan got them all straightened out, and she was my ally in that respect. But she disagreed with the president on this particular policy of abortion, and the scene I describe was where the president in the 1987 State of the Union address, as we were finalizing the speech, said to me, I don't have the exact words in front of me, but it was words to the effect, Ken, we don't have a message here for our friends about protecting the unborn, usually I have those in my speeches. And Mrs. Reagan was standing behind him and gesturing to me, shaking her head to no. And so I was sort of caught in the middle. It was a very, very uncomfortable situation. So on the one hand, he wanted the language in the speech. On the other hand, she was vigorously, aggressively shaking her head to keep the language out of the speech. And I think she was being influenced. I don't know where she was being influenced, perhaps by her family, perhaps because she thought that language was not politically correct. I don't know. I don't know what her motive was. But I knew that if I insisted on putting the language in agreement with him, that I would be caught afoul of Mrs. Reagan, which was not a very pleasant situation. So I concocted a sort of situation where I convinced the president, well, your friends know where your heart lies, and you've included it in all your other speeches, and so I think this may be this one time, if you leave it out, you can be forgiven. And so it was, I don't know, it was just I felt like I was betraying him in a way, but then on the other hand, maybe I was saving myself from getting my head cut off. So it was really, talk about being between Scylla and Charybdis, That was one of those situations.
Ken Khachigian with us, his book Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. You advised 9 presidential campaigns, and in particular, of course, Nixon and Reagan. And every president is different. Every candidate is different. Every campaign is different. I am wondering if, in reviewing your notes and thinking back to these times and writing Behind Closed Doors, you stumbled across any universal truths of campaigning and governing. Are there pieces of advice that you could give to any of those campaigns you advise that would work for all of them?
Well, there's one central theme that it works in every campaign, basically, that Richard Nixon advised President Reagan in 1980, and that's one of the themes of the book, by the way, that people didn't know about, that Nixon advised Reagan secretly in 80 and 84. That people will find out in the book. That's very important, and that Nixon put into memos to Reagan, and that is that the economy is a very central issue on people's minds, and that goes back. If you think about it, that goes back to the 20th century. It goes back to the days of Hoover and FDR and Truman and Kennedy and the years of all those other campaigns. People think about the economy. So when you think about what happens in people's lives when they wake up in the morning and go to bed at night, they think about feeding their families, paying their rent, paying their mortgage, how to get by every day. And another essential point is does someone have the depth to wear the mantle of the leader of the free world? And I think that's an issue. It's sort of subliminal, and if all else, if everything else is in the balance, if all else is equal, I think people will look at somebody and say, can that person be on the world stage and honor the country and be in a position to keep America safe in a troubled situation.
Ken Khachigian is the Director Emeritus of the Richard Nixon Foundation Board of Directors, veteran of 9 presidential campaigns, chief speechwriter and senior political advisor for Ronald Reagan, and the author of the new book, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Ken, thanks so much for joining us today on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Great to be here. Thank you. Thanks for listening to me. Thank you.
Up next, we hear excerpts from a Hillsdale College lecture from Clay Travis, co-host of the Clay and Buck Show and founder of OutKick. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Find us on X. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We now hear excerpts from a recent lecture by Clay Travis, co-host of the Clay and Buck Show and founder of OutKick. His lecture, titled Wokeness in Sports, was delivered in April of 2024 at a Hillsdale College event in Bellevue, Washington. Clay Travis begins by telling us about how he entered the world of sports journalism and why sports is so important.
I came into the world of sports as a lawyer with the idea that sports was an escape from the serious things in life. A toy chest is the way it's described of life. That sports, if you read the newspaper, and I still like to read old school newspapers, I'm sure some of you do, is one of the only sections, if not the only section, that regularly celebrates achievement, not failure. But we read sports because it is the ultimate meritocracy. The best man or woman wins, not the best man pretending to be a woman. And what they have done, what I saw, and look, I got into it as just a diehard Southeastern Conference football fan. I love college football. It's one of my passions. I love sports in general. I got into it because I wanted to escape the serious things in life. And the thing that I loved about sports, my first book I wrote was Dixieland Delight, about going around to all 12 SEC football stadiums as a fan. What I loved about it was it brought everybody together. White, black, Asian, Hispanic, male, female. If you have ever been in a crowd, your team wins a game. As you're high-fiving everybody around you in that stadium or that arena, you don't think about their race. You don't think about their gender. You don't think about their political beliefs. That is a uniquely connective moment. And the next day after a game, you could have a janitor and a neurosurgeon sitting at a table together in that cafeteria, and they could have the exact same, watch the exact same game and have a totally different opinion on the coach or the quarterback or the play calling. And you know what? That janitor and that neurosurgeon would be on equal playing fields when it came to their opinion. I've made this analogy for a while. We have created identity politics and tried to transmit it to the world of sports. Think about how often you hear somebody say now their identity as a prelude to the opinion they're about to share. Why in the world should I care what you look like? I care about the quality of your opinion. How did that happen? How did the left manage to take over sports?
Travis continues explaining why we need to have things in common and how sports helps give us that common bond. Nope.
So how do we get here? What are we seeing? Dr. Arndt's commentary was so interesting to me. We were talking during the meal. He said, everybody has to take the same courses. You have to have a common language. I took my family to Italy. I'd never gotten to go. I work way too much. But last spring break, we went to Italy. We toured all over the place. My kids were like, another cathedral. You know, if you've got young kids, they were like, another one, Dad. You know, like, but I was blown away by it because I love the idea of someone being so committed to their craft that they just try to make one thing infinitely more beautiful than it would otherwise be that will outlast their life. And if you walk into so many of those Italian cathedrals, they were competing to create monuments of everlasting glory. And you would have the most talented artist who might spend 10 years on a small part of one of those cathedrals. And you stand and look at it today, and your jaw still drops at its imposing beauty. And while I was there, I thought to myself, what has been built in my life that anybody would travel to go see hundreds of years from now? I was born in 1979. I can't think of a single edifice that is so incredible and that people are so committed to that it will still matter in 400 years. And the need for, how did they do that? Turns out, Western civilization is a profoundly good thing. And what I don't hear enough people pointing out, and I think sports is a big part of this, is your ability to rip American institutions is a luxury of Western civilization that has provided you the opportunity, the platform, and the freedom with which to do that. They truly don't understand the reason why they have the luxury to have the freedom of speech that they have is the legacy of Western civilization, which they are currently trying to destroy, which will return us to an era in which they are unable to say what they actually believe.
We're listening to excerpts from a Hillsdale College lecture by Clay Travis, co-host of the Clay and Buck Show and founder of OutKick. This from April of 2024 on wokeness in sports. Travis explains here how politics began to infiltrate sports.
Now, the truth matters. And this is where we all come in and why I'm optimistic and how it changes. What's wild to me is I think 90% of sports fans understand that men should compete against men and women should compete against women. I don't think that's a remotely controversial option. Yet the only sports media company in the world, or at least in the United States, that will say that is OutKick. The market, though, can win. And this is where Hillsdale comes in, and this is where being a voice for truth in a world that is filled with artificiality comes in. The great thing about sports is, unlike argument, two different sides of an argument can happen, and you can both leave, and you can think you both won. What I love about sports is it eliminates the uncertainty. We can all argue about who the best man or woman is or who the best team is. Game happens, and then we all agree. I have never seen the team that lost in a tournament show up and try to take the court after they didn't have the most points on a scoreboard. Everybody agrees with what happens in that contest. Over time, the truth wins because ultimately the market does decide. And I look around now and I say to myself, we're the lone voice in the wilderness on this issue. But everywhere I go, I see more and more people coming up to me and saying, thank you for saying what you said. Riley Gaines, who I talked about earlier, she's 23 years old. She was set to go be a dentist if she hadn't happened to swim against a man pretending to be a woman. And she just said, this is wrong, and changed her entire career trajectory to just fight against that. It's bravery. It's courage.
And finally, Clay Travis concludes by talking about women being taken advantage of in athletics and how we all must stand up to help truth prevail.
I don't think that this is really, for the most part, I think it's wrong. But I think it's going to have to be women talking to other women and standing up for the reality of what it is to be a woman to keep men from being able to take over women's spaces. We talk a lot about male privilege, white privilege, all these things. I got to be honest with y'all. I can't think of a higher level of privilege than I'm a dude, I'm going to pretend to be a woman, you all have to claim that I'm a woman and acknowledge it, and I'm going to become a women's champion. That's what's going on right now. That's what was just reinforced and echoed 10 days ago. So where we are is not representative of where America is. And that is why all of you, but particularly women, have to rise up and speak out and make your voices heard. Because what I believe is the rational, common sense American public sports fan is not being served by the marketplace and not being spoken to honestly. That's what we strive to do every single day at OutKick, which is why the number one thing I hear every day is, you say what I wish I could say. And I say that is a tremendous privilege, but I wish and do believe that one day in America, the truth will prevail again, and all of you will be able to say exactly what you believe without having to look over your shoulder and worry about whether it's going to cost you your job or whether some DEI employee is going to be monitoring what you posted on Facebook or on social media. And I do believe that the truth will rise again. And I think and believe that OutKick is going to be a huge part of that. But we have to take back sports, and we have to take back honesty and truth. And only then can sports return where I do believe it should be, as a place of unity rather than division in the modern American culture.
That was Clay Travis, co-host of the Clay and Buck Show, his lecture, Wokeness in Sports. You can find the full lecture at freedomlibrary.hillsdale.edu. That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Kathleen O'Toole, Ken Khachigian, his book Behind Closed Doors, and Clay Travis. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. You can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.